Good morning. My name is Jonna and I'm here with Uncanny Tales, a program presented to you by the Vancouver Public Library. I'm reading to you today from the Vancouver Public Library, which is located on the stolen homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. When we acknowledge the land, we hope that it is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the ongoing history of colonialism in our country and consider ways that we can further incorporate anti-racism and decolonization into improving our communities. To find out whose land you're watching from, please visit Whose Land. If you're looking for the link, you can find it in the chat. Today I'll be reading a story by Roald Dahl, who was a fairly dark, angry man with some twisted worldviews. He held some opinions in his life that were problematic, to say the least. And it certainly wasn't all chocolate rivers and big friendly giants. That being said, this story is one of his best shorts, and I hope you enjoy it for the words, the story, and the feeling alone. I'd like to thank the family and estate of Roald Dahl, as well as Penguin Books, who publishes his work and granted permission for us to read it today. This is The Sound Machine. The Sound Machine is featured in the book Skin and Other Stories, a collection of short stories that you can find at vpl.ca. The Sound Machine. It was a warm summer evening, and Klausner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed, and he unlocked the door, went inside, and closed the door behind him. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. Against one wall on the left there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires and batteries and small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, the shape of a child's coffin. Klausner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box, and started running his fingers along the wires, tugging gently at them to test the connection. Glancing back at the paper, then into the box, then at the paper again, checking each wire. He did this for perhaps an hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box where there were 3 dials, and he began to twiddle them, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. All the while he kept speaking softly to himself. Nothing was delicate or difficult to do, saying, "Oh, yes, yes, and now this one, yes, yes, but is this right? Is it, where's my diagram? Oh, yes, of course, yes, yes, that's right. And now, good, good, yes, yes, yes." His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, of breathlessness, of strong, suppressed excitement. Suddenly, he heard footsteps on the gravel path outside, and he straightened and turned swiftly as the door opened and a tall man came in. It was Scott. It was only Scott, the doctor. "Well, well, well," the doctor said. "So this is where you hide yourself in the evenings." "Hello, Scott," Klausner said. "Well, I happened to be passing," the doctor told him, "so I dropped in to see how you were. There was no one in the house, so I came on down here. How's that throat of yours been behaving?" "It's all right, I'm fine." "Well, now I'm here, I might as well have a look at it." "Please, don't trouble. I'm quite cured. I'm fine." The doctor began to feel the tension in the room. He looked at the black box on the bench, then he looked at the man. "You've got your hat on," he said. "Oh, have I?" Klausner reached up, removed the hat, and put it on the bench. The doctor came up closer and bent down to look into the box. "What's this?" he said. "Making a radio?" "No, just fooling around." "Well, it's got rather complicated looking innards." "Yes," Klausner seemed tense and distracted. "What is it?" the doctor asked. "It's rather a frightening looking thing, isn't it?" "Oh, it's just an idea." "Yes?" "Well, it has to do with sound, that's all." "Well, good heavens, man, don't you get enough of that sort of thing all day in your work?" "Oh, I like sound." "So it seems." The doctor went to the door, turned, and said, "Well, I won't disturb you. Glad your throat's not worrying you anymore." But he kept standing there looking at the box, intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside, curious to know what this strange patient of his was up to. "Well, what's it really for?" he asked. "You've made me quite inquisitive." Klausner looked down at the box, then at the doctor, and he reached up and began gently to scratch the lobe of his right ear. There was a pause. The doctor stood by the door, waiting, smiling. "All right, I'll tell you if you're interested." There was another pause, and the doctor could see that Klausner was having trouble about how to begin. He was shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the lobe of that ear, looking at his feet, and then at last, slowly, he said, "Well, it's like this. The theory's very simple, really. The human ear, it can't hear everything. There are sounds that are so low-pitched or so high-pitched that it can't hear them." "Oh, yes," the doctor said. "Yes. Well, speaking very roughly, any note so high that it has more than 15,000 vibrations a second, we can't hear it. Dogs have better ears than us. You can buy a whistle whose note is so high-pitched that you can't hear it at all. But a dog can hear it." "Well, yes, I've seen one," the doctor said. "Of course you have. And up on the scale, higher than the note of that whistle, there's another note, a vibration, if you like. But I prefer to think of it as a note. You can't hear that one either. And above that, there is another and another, rising right up the scale forever and ever, an endless succession of notes, an infinity of notes. There is a note, if only our ears could hear it, so high that it vibrates 1,000,000 times a second, and another 1,000,000 times as high as that, and on, higher and higher as far as the numbers go, which is infinity, eternity, beyond the stars." Klausner was becoming more animated every moment. He was a frail man, nervous and twitchy, with always moving hands. His large head inclined toward his left shoulder as though his neck were not quite strong enough to support it rigidly. His face was smooth and pale, almost white, and the pale gray eyes that blinked and peered from behind a pair of steel spectacles were bewildered, unfocused, remote. He was a frail, nervous, twitchy little man, a moth of a man, dreamy and distracted, suddenly fluttering and animated. And now the doctor, looking at that strange pale face and those pale gray eyes, felt that somehow there was about this little person a quality of distance, of immense, immeasurable distance, as though the mind were far away from where the body was. The doctor waited for him to go on. Klausner sighed and clasped his hands tightly together. "I believe," he said, speaking more slowly now, "that there is a whole world of sound about us all the time and that we cannot hear. It is possible that up there in those high-pitched, inaudible regions there is new, exciting music being made, with subtle harmonies and fierce, grinding discords, a music so powerful that it would drive us mad if only our ears were tuned to hear the sound of it. There may be anything. For all we know, there may be." "Yes," the doctor said, "but it's not very probable." "Well, why not? Why not?" Klausner pointed to a fly sitting on a small roll of copper wire on the workbench. "You see that fly? What sort of a noise is that fly making now? None that one can hear. But for all we know, the creature may be whistling like mad on a very high note, or barking, or croaking, or singing a song. It's got a mouth, hasn't it? It's got a throat." The doctor looked at the fly, and he smiled. He was still standing by the door with his hands on the doorknob. "Well," he said, "so you're going to check up on that." "Some time ago," Klausner said, "I made a simple instrument that proved to me the existence of many odd, inaudible sounds. Often I have sat and watched the needle of my instrument recording the presence of sound vibrations in the air when I myself could hear nothing. And those are the sounds I want to listen to. I want to know where they come from and who or what is making them." "And that machine on the table there," the doctor said, "is that going to allow you to hear those noises?" "It may. Who knows? So far I've had no luck. but I made some changes in it, and tonight I'm ready for another trial. This machine," he said, touching it with his hands, "is designed to pick up sound vibrations that are too far high-pitched for reception by the human ear and to convert them to a scale of audible tones. I tune it in, almost like a radio." "Well, how do you mean?" "Well, it isn't very complicated. Say I wish it to listen to the squeak of a bat. That's a fairly high-pitched sound, about 30,000 vibrations a second. The average human ear can't quite hear it. Now, if there were a bat flying around this room and I tuned in to 30,000 on my machine, I would hear the squeaking of that bat very clearly. I would even hear the correct note, F sharp or B flat or whatever it might be, but merely at a much lower pitch. Don't you understand?" The doctor looked at the long black coffin box. "And you're going to try it tonight?" "Yes." "Well, I wish you luck." He glanced at his watch. "My goodness," he said, "I must fly. Goodbye, and thank you for telling me. I must call again sometime and find out what happened." The doctor went out and closed the door behind him. For a while longer, Klausner fussed about with the wires in the black box. Then he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said, "Now we'll try again. We'll take it out into the garden this time, and then perhaps the reception will be better. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my God, it's heavy!" He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down, carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the line. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine and put the earphones over his ears. The movements of his hands were quick and precise. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement, as though he were afraid that the machine might work, and afraid also of what might happen if it did. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands starting at 15,000 and going on up to 1,000,000. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint, spasmodic crackling. Behind this crackling sound he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself, but that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were up and up towards a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. The little needle kept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see a person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand, and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away. Mrs. Saunders!" Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. "Oh, Mrs. Saunders!" And looking around, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn. A fantastic, arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. "Cut another one! Please, cut another one quickly!" She stood still, staring at him. "Why, Mr. Klausner," she said, "what's the matter?" "Please, do as I ask," he said. "Cut just one more rose." Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought, no, he's harmless. I'll just humor him. "Certainly, Mr. Klausner, if you'd like," she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down, and snipped another rose. Again, Klausner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again, it came at the exact moment that the rose stem was cut. He took off his earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens. All right, he said. "That's enough. No more, please, no more." The woman stood there, in a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders," he said. "Something that you won't believe." He put his hands on the top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles. "You have, this evening, cut a basket full of roses. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders?" "No, I certainly didn't know that." "It happens to be true," he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement. "I heard them shrieking each time you cut one. I heard the cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it." "Did you really, Mr. Klausner?" She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds. "You might say," he went on, "that a rose bush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You'd be right. It hasn't. Not like ours, anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders?" And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. "How do you know that a rose bush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shear? How do you know? It's alive, isn't it?" "Yes, Mr. Klausner. Oh, yes. And good night." Quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't sure now that it was expressing pain. No, it wasn't pain, it was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else, which we didn't know about, something called toin or spurl or plunkument or anything you like. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark, and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed, and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him, and walked up to the house. The next morning, Klausner was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. He picked up the machine and carried it outside, clasping it to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. He went past the house, out through the front gate, and across the road to the park. There he paused and looked around him. Then he went on until he came to a large tree, a beech tree. and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Quickly, he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 a.m. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint, familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, took a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as hard as he could at the base of the tree trunk. The blade cut deep into the wood and stuck there, and at the instant of impact, he heard a most extraordinary noise in the earphones. It was a new noise, unlike any he had heard before. A harsh, noteless, enormous noise, a growling, low-pitched, screaming sound, not quick and short like the noise of the roses, but drawn out like a sob, lasting for fully a minute, loudest at the moment when the axe struck, fading gradually fainter and fainter until it was gone. Klausner stared in horror at the place where the blade of the axe had sunk into the wood flesh of the tree. Then gently he took the axe handle, worked the blade loose, and threw the thing on the ground. With his fingers he touched the gash that the axe had made in the wood, touching the edges of the gash, trying to press them together to close the wound, and he kept saying, "Tree, tree, oh tree, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Oh, but it will heal just fine." For a while he stood there with his hands upon the trunk of the great tree. Then suddenly he turned away and hurried off out of the park, across the road, through the front gate, and back into his house. He went to the telephone, consulted the book, dialed a number, and waited. He held the receiver tightly in his left hand and tapped the table impatiently with his right. He heard the telephone buzzing at the other end, and then the click of a lifted receiver and a man's voice, a sleepy voice, saying, "Hello? Yes?" "Dr. Scott?" he said. "Yes, speaking." "Dr. Scott, you must come at once, quickly, please." "Who is it speaking?" "Klausner here. And you remember what I told you last night about my experience with sound and how I hoped I might—" Yes, of course. But what's the matter? Are you ill?" "No, I'm not ill, but—" "It's 6:30 a.m, the doctor said, "and you call me, but you're not ill? Please, come quickly. I want someone to hear it. It's driving me mad. I can't believe it." The doctor heard the frantic, almost hysterical note in the man's voice, the same note he was used to hearing in the voices of people who called up and said, "There's been an accident. Come quickly." He said slowly, "You really want me to get out of bed and come over now?" "Yes. Now, at once, please." "All right, then, I'll come." Klausner sat down beside the telephone and waited. He tried to remember what the shriek of the tree had sounded like, but he couldn't. He could remember only that it had been enormous and frightful, and that it made him feel sick with horror. He tried to imagine that sort of noise that a human would make if he had to stand anchored to the ground while somebody deliberately swung a small, sharp thing at his leg so that the blade cut in deep and wedged itself into the cut. Same sort of noise, perhaps? No, quite different. The noise of the tree was worse than any known human noise because of that frightening, toneless, throatless quality. He began to wonder about other living things, and he thought immediately of a field of wheat standing up straight and yellow and alive, with the mower going through it, cutting the stems, 500 stems a second, every second. Oh my God, what would that noise be like? 500 wheat plants screaming together, and every second another 500 being cut and screaming. And no, he thought, I do not want to go into a wheat field with my machine. I would never eat bread after that. And what about potatoes and cabbages and carrots and onions? And what about apples? No, apples are all right. They fall off naturally when they are ripe. Apples are all right if you let them fall off instead of tearing them from the tree branch. But not vegetables. Not a potato, for example. A potato would surely shriek. So would a carrot and an onion and a cabbage. He heard the click of the front gate latch, and he jumped up and went out and saw the tall doctor coming down the patch, little black bag in hand. "Well," said the doctor, "what's all the trouble here?" Come with me, Doctor. I want you to hear it. I called you because you're the only one I've told. It's over the road in the park. Will you come now?" The doctor looked at him. He seemed calmer now. There was no sign of madness or hysteria. He was merely disturbed and excited. They went across the road into the park. Klausner led the way to the great beech tree at the front foot of which stood the long black coffin box of the machine and the axe. "Why did you bring it out here?" the doctor asked. "I wanted a tree. There aren't any big trees in the garden." "And why the axe?" "You'll see in a moment. But now please put on these earphones and listen. Listen carefully and tell me afterwards precisely what you hear. I want to make quite sure." The doctor smiled and took the earphones and put them on over his ears. Klausner bent down and flicked the switch on the panel of the machine, and then he picked up the axe and took his stance with his legs apart, ready to swing. For a moment, he paused. "Can you hear anything?" he said to the doctor. "Can I what?" "Can you hear anything?" "Just a humming noise." Klausner stood there with the axe in his hands, trying to bring himself to swing, but the thought of the noise that the tree would make made him pause again. "What are you waiting for?" the doctor asked. "Nothing," Klausner answered, and then lifted the axe and swung it at the tree, and as he swung, he thought he could swear he felt a movement of the ground on which he stood. He felt a slight shifting of the earth beneath his feet, as though the roots of the tree were moving underneath the soil. But it was too late to check the blow when the axe blade struck the tree and wedged deep into the wood, splintering. At that moment, high overhead, there was a cracking sound of wood splintering and the swishing sound of leaves brushing against other leaves as they both looked up, and the doctor cried, "Watch out! Run, man! Quickly, run!" The doctor had ripped off the earphones and was running away fast, but Klausner stood spellbound, staring up at the great beech. The great branch, 60 feet long at least, that was bending slowly downward, breaking and crackling and splintering at its thickest point, where it joined the main trunk of the tree. The branch came crashing down, and Klausner leapt aside just in time. It fell upon the machine and smashed it into pieces. "Great heavens!" shouted the doctor as he came running back. "That was a near one. I thought it had got you." Klausner was staring up at the tree. His large head was leaning to one side, and upon his smooth white face there was a tense, horrified expression. Slowly he walked up to the tree, and gently he prized the blade loose from the trunk. "Did you hear it?" he said, turning to the doctor. His voice was barely audible. The doctor was still out of breath from running and the excitement. "Hear what?" "In the earphones. Did you hear anything when the axe struck?" The doctor began to rub the back of his neck. "Well," he said, "as a matter of fact." He paused and frowned and bit his lower lip. "No, I'm not sure. I couldn't be sure. I don't suppose I had the earphones on for more than a second after the axe struck." Yes, but what did you hear?" "I don't know," the doctor said. "I don't know what I heard. Probably the noise of the branch breaking." He was speaking rapidly, rather irritably. "What did it sound like?" Klausner leaned forward slightly, staring hard at the doctor. "Exactly what did it sound like?" "Oh, hell," the doctor said. "I really don't know. I was more interested in getting out of the way. Let's leave it." "Dr. Scott, what did it sound like?" "For God's sake, how could I tell, with half the tree falling on me and having to run for my life?" The doctor certainly seemed nervous. Klausner had sensed it now. He stood quite still, staring at the doctor, and for fully half a minute he didn't speak. The doctor moved his feet, shrugged his shoulders, and half turned to go. "Well," he said, "we better get back." "Look," said the little man, and now his smooth white face became suddenly suffused with color. "Look," he said, "you stitch this up." He pointed to the last gash that the axe had made in the tree trunk. "You stitch this up, and quickly." "Don't be silly," the doctor said. "You do as I say. Stitch it up." Klausner was gripping the axe handle, and he spoke softly in a curious, almost threatening tone. "Don't be silly," the doctor said. "I can't stitch through wood. Come on, let's get back." So you can't stitch through wood? No, of course not. Have you got any iodine in your bag? Well, what if I have? Then paint the cut with iodine. It'll sting, but that can't be helped. Now look, the doctor said, and again he turned as if to go. Let's not be ridiculous. So let's get back to the house and then paint the cut with iodine. The doctor hesitated. He saw Klausner's hands tightening on the handle of the axe. He decided that his only alternative was to run away fast, and he certainly wasn't going to do that. All right, he said. I'll paint it with iodine. He got his black bag, which was lying on the grass about 10 yards away, opened it, and took out a bottle of iodine and some cotton wool. He went up to the tree trunk, uncorked the bottle, tipped some of the iodine onto the cotton wool, bent down, and began to dab into it the cut. He kept one eye on Klausner, who was standing motionless with the axe in his hands, watching him. Well, make sure you get it right in there. Yes, the doctor said. Now do the other one, the one just above it. The doctor did as he was told. Well, there you are. It's done. He straightened up and surveyed his work in a very serious manner. That should do nicely. Klausner came closer and gravely examined the two wounds. Yes, he said, nodding his huge head slowly up and down. Yes, that will do nicely. He stepped back a pace. You'll come and look at them again tomorrow? Oh, yes, the doctor said, of course. And put some iodine on it? If necessary, yes. Thank you, doctor, Klausner said, and he nodded his head again, and he dropped the axe, and all at once he smiled, a wild, excited smile, and quickly the doctor went over to him, and gently he took him by the arm, and he said, Come on now, we must go. And suddenly they were walking away, the two of them, walking silently, rather hurriedly across the park, over the road, and back to the house. That has been a reading of The Sound Machine, written by Roald Dahl, featured in his book Skin and Other Stories. Once again, I'd really like to thank the family of Roald Dahl and the publisher Penguin Books for allowing us permissions to read this story today to you. And I just wanted to take a minute to do some shout outs to all the people watching. To Shirley M. at the South Granville Senior Center, I just want to say hello to you. And I'd also like to say hello to all the folks at the Mount Pleasant Neighborhood House and particularly those who work with the seniors there. I know this has been a really hard last year and a half, and we hope that these programs can really help to inspire that sort of community feel. We're happy to do programming here for you at the library, and we hope that you will join us for some future programs. Coming up next, from 12 until 1 p.m. today, May 28th, we have a Nishka writer, Jordan Abel, who was actually the winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize, presenting Nishka, his autobiographical meditation on the impact of Canada's residential school system and how it affects contemporary Indigenous existence. You can find that link in the chat or also by visiting vpl.ca/events. Also wanted to tell you about a really exciting event happening on June 10th from 7 till 8:30 p.m., where I hope you will join best-selling author Lindsay Wong, who is VPL's 16th writer-in-residence, as she launches her residency with a gathering of other talented Asian Canadian authors. Lindsay will be joined by Doretta Lau, Jen Suk-Fong Lee, and Roselle Lim as they all share from their latest books. The panel will also discuss Asian representation in Canadian literature and what it means to create art amidst a global crisis and escalating anti-Asian sentiment. Once again, you can find that link in the chat. You can also visit vpl.ca/events and do check out all of the really wonderful events that are going to be offered by our writer-in-residence. Lindsay will be here for a short time with us, but she's going to be doing a lot of wonderful things. You can learn more about the program at vpl.ca. And finally, please do join us on June 11th at 10 a.m. for another edition of Uncanny Tales. We really enjoyed bringing this program to you. Once again, shout-outs to all of our seniors across the nation and here in Vancouver. And for more information on upcoming programs, events, or services that the library offers, you can visit us at www.vpl.ca. Thank you for joining us today.